There was a moment in history when one empire cracked the code of total human obedience and quietly handed that blueprint to every tyrant who came after. Not through war, not through weapons, through something far more dangerous: the engineering of belief itself. The methods were so precise, so psychologically calculated, that historians still struggle to explain how an entire civilization surrendered its mind willingly. What was discovered inside that empire system wasn't just politics. It was a formula, and that formula never died. What you are about to discover has been buried inside academic archives, classified behavioral studies, and forgotten political manuscripts for centuries. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented psychological history, and it will permanently change the way you see every modern power structure around you. If this kind of forbidden knowledge disturbs you, challenges you, or makes you question everything, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. Do you think this system still operates today? Because by the end of this video, you won't just suspect it. You will know it. The Roman Empire did not conquer the ancient world simply through military force. Every serious historian who has studied its internal mechanics eventually arrives at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Rome's most powerful weapon was never the legion. It was the system designed to make conquered people forget they had ever been free. This is where the story begins. Not on a battlefield, but inside the minds of millions of people who genuinely believed they were choosing to obey. Roman administrators had discovered something that modern behavioral psychologists would only formally name 2,000 years later. When you control the narrative of a person's identity, you control their behavior without ever needing to threaten them. The process was methodical, surgical, almost invisible. It started with language. Every newly conquered territory was systematically introduced to Latin, not as an imposition, but as a privilege. Speaking the empire's language meant access to trade, to courts, to social elevation. Within a single generation, local languages began dying, and with them, the psychological frameworks those languages carried. The ancestral stories, the resistance vocabulary, the very concepts needed to imagine a different world. Historians call this process Romanization, but what they rarely emphasize is how voluntary it felt to the people living through it. That was the genius. Coercion leaves resentment. Seduction leaves loyalty. Rome chose seduction every single time. The second layer was architectural. Rome did not just build roads and aqueducts for logistical efficiency. Every monumental structure, every bath, every amphitheater, every triumphal arch was a psychological instrument. They communicated one singular message encoded into stone. This civilization is eternal, inevitable, and superior. Resistance felt not just dangerous, but cosmically absurd. The third layer was perhaps the most disturbing. Rome systematically absorbed the religious symbols of every culture it conquered, and then reframed them within the imperial narrative. Local gods were not destroyed. They were incorporated, subtly repositioned beneath the Roman pantheon. What appeared to be religious tolerance was actually a masterclass in psychological annexation. Your gods still exist. They just work for us now. Here is where the psychological mechanism becomes deeply unsettling. When you strip a population of its language, reframe its architecture, and absorb its spiritual symbols, you do not create slaves. You create volunteers. People who actively defend the system that replaced their identity, because that system has now become their identity. The Romans understood this with frightening clarity, and then they documented it. That is the detail that changes everything. Roman administrators, governors, and philosophers left behind a remarkable paper trail: letters, treatises, strategic manuscripts that reveal not just what they did, but why it worked. They were not operating on instinct. They were operating on theory, a tested, refined, exportable theory of psychological control that could be applied to any population, in any geography, at any point in history. Which means someone, at some point, read those documents, studied them, and decided to use them again. The question is not whether Rome's blueprint survived. The question is, who inherited it first? There is a document that very few people outside academic circles have ever read. Written in the early 16th century, circulated privately among European monarchs, studied obsessively by a man who would later become one of history's most quoted political philosophers. It outlined, with disturbing precision, exactly how Rome had manufactured consent. And it came with instructions on how to replicate it. The man was Niccolo Machiavelli. But the document was not the prince. It was his lesser-known work, the Discourses on Livy, a systematic psychological autopsy of the Roman Republic that read less like political theory and more like an operational manual for total societal control. What Machiavelli understood, and what he articulated with cold intellectual clarity, was that Rome's greatest achievement had nothing to do with governance. It had everything to do with perception management at a civilizational scale. He identified 3 core mechanisms that Rome had used, and he named them with uncomfortable directness: manufactured religion, strategic spectacle, and the deliberate engineering of collective fear. Manufactured religion first. Machiavelli observed that Rome's ruling class did not necessarily believe in the gods they promoted. What they believed in was the political utility of belief. A population that fears divine punishment regulates itself. It does not need constant policing. It polices itself from the inside. The empire had outsourced psychological control to the supernatural, and it worked with extraordinary efficiency. Strategic spectacle second. The gladiatorial games, the public festivals, the triumphal processions, these were not entertainment. They were calibrated emotional experiences designed to redirect collective anxiety toward controlled release. A population that experiences manufactured catharsis together develops a shared psychological identity. That shared identity becomes the invisible chain. Machiavelli saw this. He wrote about it plainly, and the monarchs who read him took notes. The third mechanism, the deliberate engineering of collective fear, is where the blueprint becomes genuinely terrifying. Rome had mastered the art of maintaining a population in a state of managed threat perception, never safe enough to relax, never threatened enough to revolt, suspended in permanent psychological tension that made the empire feel not just powerful, but necessary, like oxygen, like gravity. Now, here is the moment where history accelerates into something deeply disturbing. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, every major European power that built an authoritarian system left behind documentation showing direct intellectual lineage to these exact 3 mechanisms. The language changed, the costumes changed, the gods changed, the architecture changed, but the psychological structure remained identical, almost molecularly identical, to what Rome had engineered 15 centuries earlier. Napoleon studied Roman imperial psychology obsessively. His coronation ceremony was a deliberate reconstruction of Roman imperial ritual, not for aesthetic reasons, but because he understood that spectacle rewires collective memory. Frederick the Great of Prussia built his entire administrative philosophy around Roman models of behavioral compliance. Even the physical design of Washington, D.C., its columns, its monuments, Its deliberate visual language of permanence was a conscious psychological inheritance from Rome's architectural manipulation playbook. But none of these were the most direct inheritors. The most chilling application of Rome's psychological blueprint came from a movement that studied it not casually, not academically, but operationally, as a step-by-step system to be refined, modernized, and deployed against an entire civilization within a single decade. They even had a name for what they were building. They called it the 1,000-Year Reich. And the psychological architecture underneath it was Roman in ways that history has never fully confronted. In 1933, a man named Joseph Goebbels was handed control of something that had never existed before in human history: a ministry of public enlightenment and propaganda. The title itself was a masterpiece of psychological engineering, not a ministry of control, not a ministry of censorship, a ministry of enlightenment. The language was deliberate. The framing was deliberate. Every single detail was deliberate, because the man running it had spent years studying exactly how Rome had made obedience feel like freedom. Goebbels was not operating on intuition. He was operating on a theoretical framework so sophisticated that American advertising executives would spend the following decades quietly reverse engineering it for commercial use. He had studied crowd psychology, linguistic manipulation, and the mechanics of collective identity formation with the same intensity a surgeon studies anatomy. And what he built was not a propaganda machine. It was a psychological ecosystem. The first element he replicated from Rome's blueprint was the language mechanism. Within months of the Nazi rise to power, the German language itself began to change. New words were introduced. Old words were redefined. Concepts that had previously existed, concepts like individual conscience, political dissent, moral complexity, began losing their linguistic infrastructure. When you cannot name a feeling, you cannot organize around it. When you cannot articulate resistance, resistance becomes psychologically almost impossible. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish linguist who survived the Third Reich, documented this process in terrifying detail in his diary, later published as The Language of the Third Reich. He observed that the most dangerous weapon the regime possessed was not its military. It was its ability to infect thought through vocabulary. Words repeated often enough stopped being propaganda and started being reality. He called it the slow poisoning of consciousness. The second element was spectacle, and here the debt to Rome becomes almost architectural. The Nuremberg rallies were not political events. They were precisely engineered psychological experiences designed by Albert Speer, using principles he openly described as theatrical and almost religious in nature. The lighting, the geometry, the sound, the rhythm of the crowds. Every variable was calculated to produce a specific neurological response. Participants did not leave those rallies with new political opinions. They left with altered identities. Psychological research conducted decades after the war revealed something profoundly disturbing about Nuremberg rally participants. Surveys and testimonies consistently showed that people who attended described the experience not in political terms, but in spiritual terms: unity, transcendence, belonging, purpose. These are not the emotions of people who have been coerced. These are the emotions of people who have been seduced, exactly as Rome had seduced its conquered populations 2,000 years earlier. The third element, managed fear, was deployed with a precision Rome could never have achieved, because the Third Reich had something Rome lacked: modern communication technology. Radio broadcasts entered private homes. Newspapers saturated public spaces. Newsreels played before every film. The population was bathed continuously in a carefully calibrated mixture of pride, threat, and tribal identity. never allowed to feel fully secure, never pushed far enough into terror to trigger mass revolt. Suspended perpetually in the exact psychological state Rome's administrators had identified as optimal for compliance. But here is the dimension of this story that most historical analyses miss entirely. The Nazi psychological system was not just applied to the German population, it was exported. Systematically, intentionally. Regimes across Europe, Latin America, and Asia received direct ideological and technical assistance in replicating these mechanisms within their own populations. The blueprint was being franchised, adapted to different languages, different cultures, different historical contexts, but preserving its core psychological architecture with remarkable fidelity. And then something even more disturbing happened. When the war ended and the world recoiled in horror from what this system had produced, the system itself did not die. The people who had studied it most carefully, who understood its mechanics most intimately, did not destroy their research. They changed its language. They replaced the uniforms with suits. They replaced the rallies with television. They replaced the Ministry of Enlightenment with something far more subtle, far more pervasive, and far more difficult to identify. Because the most sophisticated evolution of Rome's psychological blueprint was not built by a dictator. It was built by a democracy. And the man who built it left behind a paper trail so explicit, so coldly self-aware, that reading it today produces a specific and deeply unsettling feeling. The feeling that you have been living inside this system your entire life without ever knowing its name. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, published a book in 1928 called Propaganda, openly declaring that the manipulation of the masses was essential to modern democracy. His methods were not intuitive, they were scientific. He engineered entire behaviors, making women smoke, Americans eat bacon, and elected governments collapse, all through the systematic exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. The system never died. It migrated to radio, television, and finally to digital algorithms, increasingly invisible, increasingly powerful. The engineers of the world's largest technology platforms themselves have publicly admitted the systems were designed to exploit the human mind like a slot machine. The Roman Empire discovered the formula. Each generation inherited and refined it. The only question that remains is the most uncomfortable of all. Are you sure you are free?